Tom, tell me today, why did you want to do this presentation for your clients and for the dairy industry?
I think all of us in the dairy industry have a responsibility of providing the consumer the guarantee that we've got wholesome, non-antibiotic contaminated milk and meat. And so the more we can help with the technical and training knowledge we have of explaining this to dairymen and the dairy industry, that's why I think we have a responsibility to do it. And I just find that for a dairyman, your milk's going to be forever tested differently because of FDA investigations that are going to occur this year, Walt. FDA is going to test their bulk tank milk for 26 different antibiotics and other medications, and they have a plan in place to get this done within the next 6 to 12 months of this calendar year. Because what we're finding is that while we're currently testing milk right now from bulk tanks, and the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance is a document that regulates that, in the year 2009 there were over 4 million tests and only 1,365 were positive. So, Walt, depending upon how you look at that, that's a very, very small number. It's less than 1/10 of 1%. On the other hand, if you look at it as a food processor or a retailer like Walmart, a restaurant like McDonald's or consumers, they expect no violations. And certainly FDA has a commitment to the consumer that there should be no violations of antibiotic residue contaminated milk. But probably, Walt, the bigger thing that's made FDA more concerned about the potential issue in dairy cattle is the evaluation of carcass animals, those going to beef. In 2008, the carcass testing revealed that there was an extremely low incidence of residues in meat. It was 0.0001%. The problem when we look at the information is that of the 879 positive carcasses that were identified, 791 of those were from culled dairy cows. So putting that in a different light, 90% of all residues from meat came from 8% of all slaughtered cattle, and those were dairy. So for that reason, FDA has come to two conclusions. One, there are some drugs that are being used on dairies that are not being screened for because they're finding them in carcasses where they can do more screening, but not in bulk tank milks. And second of all, that there's not as much control over the over-the-counter drugs like penicillin and tetracycline that are sold to dairymen legally right now. So here's what FDA is going to do within the calendar year of 2011, so we're led to believe. First of all, they're going to test milk from dairies that have had positive carcass test violations over the past 3 years. So I would tell dairymen the trigger has already been tripped, and FDA is going to be doing this evaluation because of the carcass problem. So if you're a dairyman that over the last 3 years potentially, or you think you might have had a violation where a cow you sent to beef was found positive, you can verify whether your dairy is on a list or not by going to the website that I have here and evaluate your dairy over the years of 2008, 2009, and 2010. I can tell you that there are over 1,700 dairies on that list, and FDA is going to go out and pull bulk tank milk samples from 50% of those dairies. If you're one of them, you have a 50% chance of having your bulk tank tested by an FDA regulator. They're going to screen that bulk tank sample for 27 different antibiotics and drugs, and they're going to be doing it at FDA-approved laboratories, so there's going to be a 4-day turnaround time. The significance is once your tank is being tested, if your processing company knows that, they're not going to want to commingle your milk for 4 days until the results are found. And finally, if you do have a positive residue, FDA regulators will come out to perform an on-farm follow-up investigation to determine not only the cause but the type of antibiotic and your overall antibiotic management program on your dairy. So, Walt, with that in mind, I would suggest to our clients and all dairymen around the United States that they look at improving their drug management strategies by implementing 3 recommendations. The first one you can see I've got here is to evaluate your current health management strategies. And quite honestly, Walt, I think that's what's happening today is that we have a different economic climate, and we can justify treating less cows for some of the disease problems that we're either trying to prevent or that we've treated in the past, because the economics of beef price and replacement animals is different than it was 3 and 5 years ago. So if you evaluate each of your current treatment programs, things like if you're pilling every cow that's got a retained placenta or every fresh cow, you might want to reconsider that. If you're just automatically treating every cow that's got abnormal milk, you might really reconsider whether that cow is worth treating. And here's how I think you do that. You compute what's called break-even milk. Now, most dairymen do understand what that is, Walt, but very few are actually giving their herdsmen that kind of information. In the example I'm presenting here, if it takes, under the current economic conditions, a cow to produce 71 pounds of milk to pay for both her feed and her other expenses. Now you as a dairy owner and your herdsman have an idea of whether or not a cow producing 55 pounds of milk should be treated for mastitis, for example. Once you kind of compute break-even milk and give your herdsman some guidelines, the cow that's kind of this still questionable cow, she's given 70 pounds of milk, but now you need to know other criteria about this cow to help you as a dairy owner advise your herdsman whether or not you want him to automatically go ahead with the treatment program or not. Those other criteria would include things like days in milk, days carried calf, somatic cell count, and other events in the lactation of the cow that might have an impact about what's the cure rate and whether or not this is a kind of a cow that is worth putting some extra money in. And one of the things that I would like to point out that many dairymen sort of know but aren't as cognizant of telling their herdsmen about is that greater than 80% of most treatment costs are discarded milk. So if you take that into consideration, it's going to cost you roughly $50 to treat a cow for one episode of mastitis, even if the medication cost in that cow is only $5 or $7 or $10. So the second recommendation, Walt, I would make for dairymen is to review all treatment protocols with your veterinarian. FDA views protocols as a legal agreement between a veterinarian and dairy owner. I'd like to point out that there's most situations on dairies today where drugs are being used in dairy cattle that do require a veterinarian's involvement to write a prescription or a protocol. If we look at some drugs like those that are called over-the-counter drugs, again like penicillin or tetracycline that you, a dairyman, can legally purchase, if you use those drugs in a different manner than what the manufacturer label indicates, not only is that an extra label use which requires a veterinarian's prescription, but Walt, that's the kind of thing that expands the withholding times and therefore the residue potential when dairymen use it. So for example, if a dairyman is using, or his herdsman is injecting a cow with more than 12 cc's of penicillin, and this is a normal mature 1,200 pound cow, if you're using more than 12 cc's in that cow per day, that's not only an extra label use that requires your veterinarian's prescription, it requires a prolonged withholding time of that milk. If you're using tetracycline in the uterus of fresh cows in any manner, whether it's an infusion or a bolus, that again is not only an extra label use that requires your veterinarian's direction, but also increases the withholding time that's required for putting the milk from that animal in your bulk tank. If you're using sulfa boluses, which again you can purchase over the counter legally, if you're using those other than oral administration for pneumonia, that's an extra label use. Prescription drugs like those, for example, Polyflex or Banamine or whatever, automatically require your veterinary client-patient relationship, and your veterinarian needs to be writing a prescription for those drugs also. And then finally, there are some prescription drugs that your veterinarian has already written prescriptions for, but you and he need to make sure that you're using them properly. For example, Banamine, which is used intramuscularly, is not only an illegal or an extra label use, its label requires it to be used intravenously. It does, again, extend the withholding time for that product when you're putting it in the milk. The third recommendation I have then is to retrain your herdsmen to follow the treatment protocols and the withholding times. And I think that what we need to emphasize here is the need to develop a diagnosis. I'm here to suggest to you that if your herdsman isn't trained to do an examination of the cow first, it's impossible to arrive at a diagnosis. Once the diagnosis is made, then the diagnosis can say this is the treatment protocol to apply. And a simple example I'm going to give you is lameness. Lameness is not a diagnosis. Lameness is a symptom. The reason the cow is lame is either because she's got hoof rot, hairy wart, sole abscess, laminitis, or an injury. And the reason it could be either of those five is because the treatment for each one is different. And the treatment for each of those five causes, only one of which requires systemic antibiotic use. So my point is, if we can train a herdsman to thoroughly examine a cow so that he or she arrives at a diagnosis, then the application of a treatment protocol is very, very simple. Because once the diagnosis is made, we simply apply the treatment protocol. If we're going to have a protocol for foot rot, that's going to require a systemic antibiotic. But if I know the lameness is hairy wart, that's a different treatment protocol. If we can do that, the final thing we really need to train your herdsman to do is to write treatments in the records. FDA has identified that you can keep records either electronic or written. But the point is, if we don't have those records every day, then either you can't assure your ultimate consumer that you don't have antibiotic residue-laden milk or meat, and you can't satisfy FDA regulations should they come to your dairy and do a follow-up evaluation. So in summary, what I have recognized working as a veterinarian and being involved in this whole arena of residue avoidance over the last 20 years is that we have to be a lot more cognizant of the risks of contaminating the food supply, milk or meat, with the antibiotics we're using on our dairy cows. If you are caught in a scenario where your milk is contaminating a bulk tank, you will have to dump your milk for several days. You may also have to buy other milk that your milk may contaminate. You will face potential FDA investigation. You could possibly cause, from that investigation, a milk product recall. That obviously gives a black eye for the dairy industry. So I think what we really have to understand is that we are now much more directly in front of our consumers, whether it's processors, retailers, restaurants, or consumers, and that FDA is forcing us to be a whole lot more responsible for the drugs we're using in our dairy animals.
Thanks for your time today, Tom, discussing how to avoid antibiotic residues. We look forward to hearing more about this topic in the future.